Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Renaissance Woodworker Live. Another Wednesday, another early evening here in the shop, another day in quarantine, another triathlon canceled from my schedule. Yay. All this running and biking, well, not a lot of swimming lately, but hopefully I'm going to get to race at some point this year. Who knows? I guess I can channel all this physical fitness and speed into woodworking. Not that it takes a lot of strength, but you know, hey, I'm fit at least. Sure would be nice to race at some point. So anyway, that's not why you guys are here. You're here for, I don't know why you're here. I don't have an agenda this week. Every now and then I want to just open it up. I get lots of questions all the time, and when I do specific topics, sometimes I don't get to those questions. A lot of times when I do these open Q&As, I don't even get to all the questions that get asked because I try to keep this thing to an hour. So I have a couple of questions that were emailed in from my patrons, which that little thing at the bottom, if that wasn't obvious enough, feel free, if you like what I'm doing here, support the show, patreon.com/Renaissance Woodworker. I've got a bunch of people who've sponsored. Thank you, all the patrons who sponsor me over there. And certainly it gives you front row or VIP question answering. So with that in mind, those of you who are in the chat room, by all means, start asking questions. Like I do every week, put them in all caps. It just makes them stick out so I can see them. I can see there's one from across the room. I can see it. But I wanted to start a little bit talking about the thicknesses of blades. I've got a video out there on restoring an old jack plane and turning it into like a Fore plane. And the whole premise of that video is it's stupid easy because the Fore plane takes such heavy shavings, the sole of the plane really doesn't have to be flat. All of the little fine-tuning fettling that we do to tune up an old vintage plane really doesn't need to happen in the case of a Fore plane because it is not designed really to flatten boards. It certainly flattens boards, but it does so with such a heavy shaving that the flatness of the sole of a 300-year-old plane is probably flat enough. So really what it comes down to is cleaning it up, removing any active rust blooms, putting a coat of wax on the whole thing, a little bit of fettling of the frog so that the blade at least beds cleanly against the frog, and sharpening the blade. That's really it. A lot of times you may have to open up the mouth a whole bunch on a vintage plane because with the heavier the cut, the thicker the shaving, the more room you need in the mouth ahead of the blade to allow that shaving to pass by. And I submit that you need actually even more room in the mouth with a Fore plane or a scrub plane shaving because those shavings certainly are thick, but they also curl quite aggressively because there's a fair amount of strength. You know, if you've got a thousandth of an inch thick shaving, it's quite flimsy and bendy, right? Because it's so thin. The thicker the shaving, if you're taking a 1/16 of an inch shaving, that's got a lot more thickness, a lot more strength to stay flat. So it hits the chip breaker and it bends, but then it bends kind of aggressively, and they can get clogged really easily in the mouth because there is quite a bit of internal strength in the shaving itself. Moreover, because we're using a curved iron, we're taking these scoops out, which makes taking a heavier shaving easy, but it also can sometimes not only curl the shaving along the long axis of the plane, but it can kind of cup it from side to side because you're scooping out this piece. So you're getting a shaving that's kind of feathering off to nothing at the sides and thicker in the middle, and it curls on you. And that shaving can clog in the mouth even more. So the question I got is, in restoring one of the old vintage planes, should you go the extra step, like a lot of people recommend, and get a modern blade, a thicker blade? Thicker blades obviously reduce vibration because they dampen vibration just because of the mass of the blade. Also, a lot of the vintage irons, who knows what's happened to them. Maybe the temper's been drawn from them, and if you're not into, metalworking and dealing with heat treating and everything, that might be something you don't want to deal with. A brand new iron is certainly going to give you a leg forward. But here's the thing, you have to make sure you've got that additional mouth opening. So what you would do, and I'm going to use this number 2 I have as an example, because the Fore plane I'm using these days is a Veritas foreplane. That's the other thing in that boat anchor to foreplane video I will talk about is you do not need a premium plane for that. This was a gift, folks. This was given to me by my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law also was gracious enough one Christmas to give me this Veritas scrub plane. Never asked for it, but I got it. Great thing, right? Both of those tools do not need any level of precision. So spending the money on a precision flat Veritas or Lie-Nielsen sole is just silly. It's really silly. You can use any old vintage jack plane for foreplane, any old vintage smoother or number 4 or even number 3 for a scrub plane. But you'll see there's a marked thickness difference between this Veritas plane, that's about 1/8 of an inch thick, and this vintage Stanley, just a hair heavier than 1/16 of an inch. So really, we're talking almost a doubling in thickness of a vintage plane, and that's pretty standard for Lie-Nielsen blades as well. They are certainly thicker than their vintage counterparts. So what you have to do is back the frog all the way back on that vintage plane and see what is the mouth opening you have with your vintage blade. And then double the blade thickness and figure out what's left. And if you have, I've taken 1/8 of an inch thick shaving before with a foreplane. It's doable. It is a little bit harder work and it sometimes can get out of control really fast. 1/16 of an inch shaving is pretty common though. So what you want to do is measure that distance you have left, and I would say you want at least double the thickness of the shaving that you're going to take, the maximum thickness of shaving. So if you measure that and then account for the doubling in thickness of a modern iron, and you still have 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch left, you're good to go, and you can feel good about buying one of those modern blades, an IBC blade, a Veritas blade, even a Hawk blade, any of the suppliers of blades. You can feel good about that. I know on Veritas's website, they actually have a little conversion showing vintage Stanley plane, here's the size of the iron you should buy from Veritas. I think a lot of the manufacturers have that. So that's the first thing you need to make sure of, is that that thickness is not going to interfere with anything when the frog is backed all the way back. And if you're not sure how to do that, you loosen the screws in the base of the frog, and there's a little adjuster nut in the back that kind of runs on a collet. And as you unscrew it, that collet moves the frog all the way back. You should be able to get the mouth opening you need even by doubling the thickness of the blade. But is it really necessary? That's what I'm going to say. Unless your blade, your vintage blade that is really torn up and has all kinds of problems with it, and it's the temper's been drawn out of it and it won't hold an edge, and it's just crappy steel, depending on where it came from. It could be crappy steel. You really don't need smoothing plane results. You do need a sharp blade, but because of the curvature of the iron, I use about an 8-inch radius on my foreplane iron and a 3-inch radius on my scrub plane iron. Because of that radical radius, that scooping action actually allows the blade to be a little bit duller and still take a clean shaving as compared to a flat iron that the entire edge is engaging all at once. That scooping action makes things so much easier. Here's your test. It's a delicious test. Go up to the freezer and pull out that tub of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Now, grab a knife and try to scoop out some ice cream from that frozen block of ice cream. And you'll be able to get some, but it'll come out in this little sliver and it will require a lot of force. Now grab a spoon, and you'll find that that spoon will dig not only deeper, but with less force in pulling out that ice cream. Then, when you're done with that, eat the ice cream, and now you've had a delicious test. There it is. You know, ice cream to wood. Okay, but you get the idea, right? The curvature on that blade allows that scooping action to ease some of the force and allows you to take a much thicker shaving. That's why we can pull off that 1/8 of an inch thick shaving. So the thickness of the iron, if it vibrates around on you, that's not really going to be that much of an issue. Vibration of the iron can be a problem when you're taking thousands of an inch shavings and you're trying to avoid tear out in difficult woods and things like that. The foreplane, the scrub plane, is not really about controlling tear out. It's about quickly removing material, sculpting the board to a flat-ish shape. Then you follow up with your more refined planes, your pinky out planes. That's the goal of this guy. There's no reason to have a heavily cambered iron on a plane that does anything but rough work. So if your vintage blade at least beds decently against the frog, if it is rocking all over the place because the frog is really out of flat or the back of the blade is out of flat, that's going to cause a problem. And you're going to get clogging behind the blade. You're going to get the blade moving around. You're going to have it tearing in and just not performing very well. But if it beds at all against the frog, I would recommend grinding a camber on it, sharpening it up, and see how it works. I've obviously worked with this Veritas foreplane a lot. I've worked with vintage number 5 jack planes. I've worked with vintage number 6 jack planes for years and years and years. When I was volunteering at the Stepping Stone Museum, I've had like 8 vintage number 5s in my shop at one point. I've worked with them a lot. I honestly can't see any major performance difference from one to the other. I have no doubt that there's greater vibration dampening. There's greater edge life on a modern blade. So there is something, I will get to that in a minute. But I don't know that you're gonna suddenly see this light bulb kick on and go, oh my God, my foreplane, my scrub plane works so much better because now I have a modern iron in it. There's gonna be vibration, but the scooping action alleviates a lot of that. And really the desired result, it's not about super clean surface. If you're getting a really ugly surface, you need to sharpen your blade. I say this in the hand tool school all the time, sharp fixes everything. If you're having problems with that scrub plane, sharpen the blade, it will be fixed. More than likely, 99% of the time, it will be fixed. Now, the one reason that I would say get a modern blade, and Veritas, you're welcome. You can send the endorsement check along shortly. PMV11 steel, that stuff is magic. Absolutely incredible. Stuff didn't exist when I got into hand tools, so I only have 2 PMV11 blades in my shop. One of them is on my shooting plane because that's the most recent plane that I bought and PMV11 existed then. If you're not familiar with this stuff, it's a powdered metal composite steel. It's incredibly durable, marked difference in the edge life, and it's super easy to sharpen. So when you get into the harder steels, they last a lot longer, the edge lasts a lot longer, but they can be much harder to sharpen. A lot of times it almost feels like it's skating across your stone because it's so hard. PMV11 has this wonderful kind of smooth feel on my diamond stones. It's similar to an 01 steel, but actually feels even cushier than 01. It sharpens super fast, but I love the edge durability on it. It's one of the reasons that I opted for it in my shooting plane, because obviously a shooting plane is shooting in grain, the toughest of all planing tasks. And I hate pulling that thing out and sharpening it because it's a skewed blade and there's a little bit of fiddling to get the thing set back up again. I wish they would come out with PMV11 steel for the Veritas Rabbit plane. Actually, they might now. I haven't checked recently because that sucker, I hate pulling the blade out of that because it's so finicky to get set back up right. If I would have to sharpen that less, that would be a big deal. So there is the advantage of doing that. Now you may find some better edge retention in modern steels just in general, whether it's Lee-Nielsen, Veritas, IBC, Hawk, any of those guys. But I can tell you for certain that the PMV11 to me is a game changer. So if you really are looking to kind of, I don't want to say supercharge your foreplane because as I said, I really don't think it's a performance thing, but if you're looking to embrace the inner laziness and sharpen less, that would be a good upgrade. So there's, oh man, I just forgot who asked that question. I think it was Tom. So Tom, there's your long-winded answer to a relatively short question there. I'm not convinced that you're going to see massive performance results there. So, question in the chat room is on a spear point marking knife, how important is the actual point, the pointy bit? Because I'm always knocking it off. I will actually say it is quite important, and rather than me yammering on about it, let me show you why I think that, because it's one of the reasons that I use a spear point marking knife over other styles of marking knives. Other styles of marking knives. So I have a board and I want to mark that board. I actually want to mark a rabbit. And you know what? This is an actual project I'm working on, so I don't want to just randomly mark a rabbit somewhere. I want to mark a rabbet somewhere. That's where I need to be. So I'm just going to mark up, a fun rabbet here and not screw up the piece that I'm already working on. So what I like about the spear point is the point itself cuts deeper into the wood. So here's a blue spruce marking knife. I've got two bevels here. The bevels are fantastic because when you cut these longer knife edges on the bevels, they provide a longer reference surface, and you can stay up against a square, or if you've got especially porous wood, you can often stay on your line much easier than you could because you're presenting more blade to the surface. On the contrast, actually, let me rephrase that. I just said ring porous wood. On a diffuse porous, small pored wood, this is great to allow you to hold your line. On a wide open ring porous wood, large pored wood like oak, oftentimes that wider reference surface, so if I'm laying the blade down and using the whole part of the blade, that may want to kind of grab in those open pores, and you might not mark right along your gauge, your ruler, your straight edge, whatever, and you might end up following the grain because this wider blade can actually cause some problems for you and it might drop in. So the spear point, standing the blade up, presents a very small surface, and it will usually mark in a much straighter line. Which, by the way, this is also why we use things like scratch awls. Here's a scratch awl that I made on my lathe. If I'm marking along the grain on a large pored wood, parallel to the grain, I will use a scratch awl before I will use a marking knife. But the marking knife, because it's got a point and a wider blade, it gives you a little flexibility there. But the real reason I like this is when it comes to actually marking out joinery. I usually will mark in a series of passes. So at least 3 passes. Now I'm going to lower the blade down and present the longer edge here in order to ride right up against my square, present a larger reference surface. Plus it slices the wood really nicely and it gets my cut started. But it's not particularly deep because I'm presenting the entire cutting edge at once, and it's going to be a lot harder to drive that much steel into the wood than it is with a little point. So a couple of passes there and I've got the line established. So now I'm going to come back and I'm going to stand the blade up and I'm going to really use that point. Now I'm driving less steel into the wood so I can actually cut deeper. But because I'd already set that line using the wider part of the blade, the tiny little point has something in which to navigate in. Because obviously when you're using the point, think of it this way, you've got a really tight wheelbase and it's real easy to turn and go off your line. When you present the wide part of the blade, you've got a longer wheelbase and it's not real easy to steer off your line. It will follow a straight line a lot easier. So I created this straight line with a wider blade and now I can really dig into this. And there are certain instances where I want an even deeper marking line. I mean, this one's really deep now. I'm like a 1/16 of an inch deep at this point. But standing it up and using that point allows me to do that. And there are some woods that are really difficult than this. This is teak. It's actually, I think, one of the easier woods to work with. It's a shame it's so bloody expensive because it is a fantastic wood to work. But if you're doing Douglas fir, for example, where you have a dramatic difference in hardness from early wood to late wood, and the blade wants to jump all over the place, laying that blade down and setting that line first and then tipping it up, and you can really cut into those hard late wood sections of Douglas fir. Instead of getting that washboard look as your blade jumps all over the place, that sharper point, again, smaller cross section of steel being driven into the wood, will allow you to cut deeper into those really, really dense sections. It's also going to play for continuous density woods like hard maple. You know, you can get that line started with a wide part of the blade, but you really can't get deep because the wood is just so hard. So standing that up, use the point, and you're going to get a much deeper and easier to follow marking line if you use a first-class saw cut and all that fun stuff. Wow, good questions in here. Lots of good questions in here. All right. We'll just try to go down the line and get through them as fast as we can here. Stephen, how do you resaw a 7+ foot board? Okay. First question you have to ask yourself is why? Why? And there are legitimate answers to that as to why you would want that. Just make sure that the finished part that you needs to be 7+ feet long. Because if not, why are you making life so hard on yourself? Cross-cut that sucker down and then resaw it that way. Because the fastest way to flatten a board, again, here's another hand tool school adage, fastest way to flatten a board is with a saw, not with a plane. So you've got a 7-foot long board, it's gonna have some bow. So cut that sucker in half and the bow is mostly gone. So assuming that there is a legitimate answer, I've got, 16-quarter boards and I'm making bed rails out of it, and I want to cut that 16-quarter board in half, so I've got two little less than 2-inch thick boards to make my rails. That's a legitimate reason. Although, unless you got that wood for free, because 16-quarter, that's expensive stuff. I would recommend going back to the lumberyard and buying 2 8-quarter boards, saving yourself a lot of trouble, because that just sounds a lot like work. So again, ask yourself, do I really need this? Would it actually be easier to go buy 2 8-quarter boards? Or maybe there's another reason. Maybe you're making veneer, but why you would need 7-foot long veneer, I don't know. Let's just assume there is a reason that you need to resaw a board that is that long. Shoot, I don't know that I have anything that long in the shop right now. Here's what I'll do. We're just gonna have to pretend. So what you do, the beauty of resaws is a rip cut, right? So you treat this the same way you would treat a tenon. And there are certainly reasons to resaw with a board vertical, straight up and down. I do this a lot where I can often, because I'm flipping directions like every 10 or 15 strokes, I find that if I stand the board straight up, I can saw really well from this side, and instead of actually loosening the vise and flipping the board around, I come around to the other side and I saw from that side as well. One thing that works really poorly is when you've got a board angled in your vise, and it's great sawing from this side. This is how I saw all my tenons. This presents a better angle of attack for the saw, but it also allows me to see the edge and the end at the same time and track that line along 2 surfaces. But if you come over to the other side and try to saw it in this orientation, first of all, it's difficult to see the line on the edge because it's angled down and it's in shadow. Second of all, this sucks. This is essentially like petting the cat the wrong way, and you're gonna get all kinds of tear out. The saw is gonna jump all over the place. It's gonna wanna grab because of the way you're attacking the fibers. You're kind of coming down the wood, almost like you're trying to split it apart. So sawing from this angle is bad news. So with a resaw, this is really how I'm going to attack it, at an angle. This is a probably 4-foot board. If it were 7 feet, I could very easily angle it even further and even further and even further, to the point where sometimes it might almost be horizontal. And what you're doing is you're changing your sawing to the point where instead of sawing straight across, I'm now sawing more down. Now that can be a little bit difficult because it does change the operation from a hips and legs thing into the shoulders. And with a big frame resaw like the one I use, that can sometimes cause the blade to stick. It can also be a little bit more work. So what I would do is start back sawing like I normally am, but I've really got the board laid down. The advantage to this, and this is how I would do it on a longer board anyway, the advantage to this is I can track a really long line. So I'm sawing at a low angle to the board. It's not as efficient, but I've also got a 48-inch blade. So I've got to be cutting a lot of wood before I'm not able to excavate the sawdust. So laying that down engages more and more and more of those teeth, and you can really track your line really well. And then once you've gotten to the point where it's getting a little awkward, you track the line, say 4 feet down the board at a really shallow angle, then you can move up on the board and if necessary, stand on a block so you get a little bit more height and work down. Now I've established a kerf down the edge, I've removed a little bit of wood, the saw is going to start easier because we've already established that kerf. And in the process of even laying the board like really far down, I know, one of these days, guys, I'm going to lubricate my vise. It seems like that's become a real irritating point for people, that my vise squeaks. Doesn't bother me at all. But right now, I've got this thing probably at a 20-degree angle to my vise. I could very easily, let's just do some measuring here. 4 feet. I could put an 8-foot board easily across my bench, and it actually would be great because it would cross in front of the back leg here, and I've got a holdfast on the leg that it could actually rest on, but it also could be another point of attachment. So very easily I could get 8 feet. I could probably go all the way out to about 11 feet before it's actually going to touch the ground back here. So you can see this lower angle, yes, it's quite low, but if I'm presenting the frame saw to it, it's going to cut very easily. And I'm not going to cut this board because I actually need this board. But I can set this down, and with a fair amount of clearance, I could continue cutting like I normally would, probably get to about 2 feet down the board, setting the kerf 2 feet along the edge. And in the process, just working at this angle, I probably will end up sinking at least past the 2/3 point along the end grain. So now I've got a kerf that runs from 2/3 the width. This is about a 5-inch thick board. So we'll just say it's 4 inches deep to about 24 inches down the board. That is a super long hypotenuse in that triangle. That's going to give me a heck of a lot of guidance. So when I now decide to kind of step up on the board and change my angle and start to saw down, that's going to give me a lot of guidance in that kerf. It's going to make it really easy to quickly progress that cut to about 2 feet long. And then I would loosen the vise, scoot the board forward, and continue to cut. And go through a series of steps where I'm laying the blade down, cutting at that shallow angle, standing it up, and cutting straight down. You also could lower the board down a little bit. Instead of it being at an angle, you could drop it straight parallel and then come down on top of it. Using the 48-inch saw might be a little bit cumbersome, and as I said, you might actually want to like stand up on a block. I've actually stood on my bench before and sawn. It's particularly uncomfortable because I'm 6'4" and I only have just under 8-foot ceilings in here, but I was able to actually get quite a bit of leverage on the thing, and it works just fine. It's the exact same process that I would follow if, say, I needed to cut, a tenon on the end of a bed rail, and you're dealing with a 7-foot board, 8-foot board, and you've got a saw joinery on the end. You obviously can't stand it up vertically because it doesn't work that way. There is a long ago video, actually I think it's in my Workbench, because I have dovetails on the end of this front beam. This bench is about 8.5 feet long. I needed to cut dovetails on the end of an 8-foot board. So what I did, I have a split level house. When you come in the front door, there's 7 steps up, 7 steps down. I stood on the top level and I ran the board down into the lower level. So I don't know, it's probably 12 feet all the way down. So I had plenty of room. I could actually clamp the board to the hand railing at the top of the stairs. It ran all the way down, and I stood and I saw the board. You can actually see the video somewhere in my Rubo build when it came to after installing the end vise is when I did it. So that's another way you could do it. But today, if I were to do that process again, I would just lay the whole thing down at an angle, because you find that lower angle is going to make that cut that much easier to make. Dribble glass. My windows are interfering with the chat room here. Interesting question. So Wooden Things and Stuff says, what's the relationship between standing too close or too far from a dovetail cut and the drift of the cut? Like, does it go left if you're too close and right if you're too far away, for example? The answer to that is dependent highly upon whether you're left-handed or right-handed and what you're sawing with. The easy answer is it all depends upon the body mechanics. And let's move the camera back a little bit and tilt it down and see if I can pull this off, because the camera's actually sitting on my dovetail bench right now. Here's a nice piece of white cedar. And here's the dovetail saw. So I'm going to be sawing dovetails on this board. When you're sawing tails, the key thing is not that angle, that tail angle. The key thing is that angle, the square angle across the end grain. Because if that is not square, what you've created is a wedge, and that wedge will pop your pin board apart in seconds. This angle, it doesn't matter. I mean, you can get fancy and you can have, perfectly spaced angles that are all the same, and you can use a dovetail layout, and that's fine. There's an aesthetic reason for that. But there's also, you'll find a lot of variations in that angle that exist in masterpiece furniture. So this angle doesn't matter. Whether they're all the same or they're all wonky and different, you're going to transpose that angle onto your pin board when you start tails first. This angle matters. Otherwise, you're going to do a lot of pairing in order to correct a wedge tail into a square tail. That will actually slide into your board. So that's the one you want to get. So what I'm really focusing on, and what you're asking is, if I stand real close here, what is it going to do to my angle? Well, what happens when I stand real close is I get very cramped in my shoulder and my wrist. And as I stand real close, my torso actually pushes on my wrist. Now it's actually bumping into my wrist, and it's causing my elbow to bend out at an angle. And I'm exaggerating here to show it. But what that's going to do is it's going to cause the saw to actually drift to the left-hand side, the right-hand side in the back, because it's turning the saw. You can see the angle that I'm now forming. Here's straight across, but as I stand real close, I just automatically bumped the saw over the handle over to the left, the toe out to the right, and that's going to make it drift. I guess technically the side I'm looking at is going to make it drift to the left. If I stand too far away, what's happening now is I'm stretching my body out, and I'm causing my shoulder to come out of alignment with the saw. So we're a little bit off angle in the camera angle here, but the saw, the spine is running here, comes down the handle. I'm relatively in line with my wrist, but because I'm standing so far away, my forearm starts to twist, and now I'm deviating. My bicep is moving off at an angle. My shoulder is now in a different geometric plane from my forearm. There's probably an inch or maybe 3/4 of an inch difference from this geometric plane to this geometric plane. And what that's doing is forcing the saw to go offline. And it's going to go the same direction, really, because I'm now pulling it a different way. So it's going to deviate off. I'm sorry, no, it's going the opposite direction because I'm now pulling it offline. So it's deviating on the side that towards me, towards the right, on the back towards the left. What side it's deviating from doesn't really matter, because this is going to change if you go to your right hand. The side that it's going doesn't matter. What you need to be doing is not thinking so much about, okay, it's deviating to the left, so I need to scoot forward or scoot back. What you need to be thinking about with every single cut you make, tenon, dovetail, dado, rip cut, cross cut, what is my body alignment like? And is the geometric plane that I am creating from the spine to my shoulder one geometric plane? Does the spine run to my wrist, to my forearm, my elbow, to my shoulder, all in one geometric plane? If it does, you're going to saw straight. You're going to saw the way you want it to saw. When things start to deviate one way or another, it's because that geometric plane is broken. So don't think so much about the direction it's going, but just step back and think about and look. I'm off camera, but I literally look down at my arm and see, are things lined up? Actually, they're not a little bit. My shoulder is moving off at an angle. So what I do, and I've got a video called Take a Step Back, I take a step back, and what that does is actually lower my stance, and now everything is perfectly in line. It all lines up, and it's going to saw straight that way. That's the only thing you need to think about when it comes to sawing straight. Don't get too caught up in, it's moving this way, so I need to adjust this. Focus on your body alignment, and it can be really beneficial to saw in front of a mirror or set up a camera and film yourself in head on as you're sawing, and then film yourself in profile. You will learn so much seeing little hitches in your saw stroke and where your arm is moving out one way or another, or oftentimes you'll see yourself doing these weird contortion moves as you're trying to make a cut. So the thing that I always say is set up, get everything nice and in the same geometric plane, and then kind of do a body scan. Am I comfortable? Am I standing in a comfortable stance? Or am I kind of off balance? Or this is tweaking my wrist in a weird way? Well, then adjust your stance. Usually that involves taking a step back, widening, dropping your center of gravity, and then realign your body so that now that geometric plane is all the same. The key is keeping that plane the same, but doing it in a comfortable way. Because if you're contorting yourself in some way or you're off balance, as you're making that cut, your body is going to adjust on its own in order to correct an off balance issue or, ow, this is uncomfortable. It will move into a more comfortable or more balanced position. And when it does, it's going to break that geometric plane and throw your cut off line. So establish comfort, establish balance, then set your geometric plane and you're good to go. I mean, it sounds like I'm oversimplifying things, but that's all there is to sawing. Keep that plane the same no matter whether you're sawing at a bench, sawing down on a saw bench, sawing upside down on a Tuesday afternoon. It does not matter. If you keep that alignment right and make sure that as your stroke moves, there's nothing getting in the way and causing that geometric plane to change. So if I'm too close, my arm bumps into my torso and it has to navigate its way around it, which breaks the geometric plane. How many times can I say geometric plane in 5 minutes? I think I now have the Guinness Book of World, Guinness record on that. Yay for me. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. I kind of took your question and went another direction with it. Chopping a mortise with a bevel-edged chisel. Is there a good technique? How much extra room do you leave on the width? I chop a mortise with a bevel-edged chisel the same way I chop a mortise with a mortise chisel. I don't leave any extra width. The goal with I think any hand tool operation is to slave your tooling to your joinery. So if you bought, say, some Narex chisels, Narex chisels they're not imperial, they are metric, but you have, imperial rulers. You're like, oh man, I don't have a 3/8 inch chisel. I have whatever the Narex equivalent is, It doesn't matter. What you do is you grab a marking gauge, get yourself a marking gauge, you set your marking gauge to the width of your chisel. You literally drop your chisel in there, you tighten it up, and you're good to go. Now you lay out your mortise around your chisel. I do not leave any extra width to then pair up later, because then I have to come back and pair it later. And why would I want to do that? That's an extra step. The only time that I do, if I'm boring out a mortise, and I do this a lot with through mortises because it's just easier to bore a hole through, it's faster. I will often step down by 1 auger bit size to give me a little bit of room, just to compensate for the fact that maybe I'm not boring exactly straight, or maybe there's a little bit of wobble in my brace and it deviates slightly. It gives me a little bit of wiggle room, literally wiggle room, as I bore it out. Then I come back and pair that. But if you think about it, if you're boring out a mortise, you have to come back and pair out the little holes you've made and create straight walls. So you have to do that anyway. If I'm chopping a mortise, I'm going to choose my mortise based upon the chisel that I use. So let's just beat up on this piece of cedar that we've already started working on here. Here's a fun little work holding thing. I'm sure I've shown this in videos before, but I don't like to put, if I'm chopping a mortise, I don't like to put it in the vise because that's a lot of force. And no matter what you do as you chop, it's going to slip in the vise. So I always want to actually stand it on the bench itself, and it makes the most sense to actually put it over a bench leg, because now I've got the greatest, I'm working directly into the ground. And granted, there's little to no flex in this 4-inch thick ash bench top, but say you're working on something thinner than that, and you may find that there's a little bit of flex or a little bit of vibration as you're chopping. So if you put the workpiece directly over your bench leg, it's going to give you the best return on that force. So I could go to the closer camera, but I think it's more important. The technique to focus on here is, again, it's the same mortising technique, but I think it's more of a full body shot is going to give you better luck here. So if I've got a mortise in the middle of this board, I will always chop with the bevel, not always, the direction that I'm heading. So I want to start on the side near to me and work toward the other side of the mortise farther away. I will work in the direction of the bevel. So the bevel is now facing away from me because I'm going to chop towards the camera. What I will do is always stand so that I am along the long axis of the mortise that I'm creating. So what this allows me to do is see whether I'm square in this direction. I can stand here and I can see if I'm square straight up and down, but that's not really the important part. The only time this is important is when you come to the very end of the mortise and you want to get it square. And even then, is it really that important to be square at the ends of the mortise? Not all that much. What's important, the glue holding power of a mortise, is this direction. Those big wide tenon cheeks and the wide cheeks of the mortise creates a hell of a lot of glue surface. Not so much glue surface on this side. Plus we're dealing with ingrain on the mortise walls. So what's important, most important, is getting square this way as I move down the mortise. So I'm going to stand here and I'm going to eyeball square. Or if you're not comfortable eyeballing square, set a square up next to it and compare the difference. I'm going to one whack. That's basically all I'm going to do. When I'm just getting started, it's not about trying to drive that chisel as deep as possible. It's also not about wailing on the chisel. I've got, a blue spruce mallet here that's relatively beefy, so I really don't need to wail on this because it's already providing a fair amount of force. I'm going to move the chisel down the line and I'm going to whack it again. The reason I don't want to wallop on this too much is when I'm just getting started, the chisels in this operation, it's not about sharpness, although you don't want to use a dull blade here. What this is about is the wedge. The wedge is doing the work here. So with the wedge facing away from me, the bevel facing away from me, as I chop, the chisel is driving back towards me. The wedge is pushing it back towards me. You get to a certain point, and if I were to keep chopping, you'll hear the pitch change where it just stops moving. Because what's happened is it's wedged itself in so tight, the wood is compressed away from it and it won't compress anymore. And the harder you chop, the more you pound on the thing, the more damage you may be doing to the handle, and more importantly, the more damage you'll probably be doing to your project piece, and also prematurely dulling the edge of your chisel. That one chop drives the chisel back, but it also drives the waste back towards me. And because I'm moving the cutting action away from me, I've already kind of chopped up the wood behind the blade. I've perforated it, if you will. That wedging action not only drives the chisel deeper, but it pushes back and it frees some of the waste that I've already chopped. So I can then do this rocking action and it levers material out of the wood. And I know you can't really see that too well from afar, but I have now cleared my mortise just by moving in one direction and continuing. Now this is, Eastern cedar. It's soft. So it clears out very quickly. When I get to the end of the mortise, I can then turn the chisel around so the bevel's facing me, because now I want to define that end wall, right? So I give it a little tap just to seat it, and then I come around at 90 degrees. So now I'm trying to get that angle on the end wall. Now I do want to see this angle. And here it's light taps. I mean, I could grab the mallet on the head. That's how light a tap we're talking about. This is not we're not thoring this sucker. Because you have removed so much material on this already, this action now, this truing up the end wall, this is a cutting action and not a wedging action. So we've got dead space that we've already chopped. So as I chop down, there's plenty of room for the waste I'm creating to move into. So that wedge is not drawing up tight and it will continue to cut all the way to the bottom of the mortise. So in this one pass, I haven't reached my final depth here. So what I would do, I would come to, maybe 1/8 of an inch towards the end of the mortise. I don't really count. I just get close to the end of the mortise, but not all the way. Then I'm going to turn the bevel around facing me, and I'm going to work back across the mortise in the direction I just came. So now I'm working towards me, and that's why I've switched the bevel. So what I'm doing now is wedging the opposite direction, but I'm now being able to drive deeper. I'm still only doing that one chop, maybe 2 chops, and it's driving deeper on the second pass. Now here, what I'll do is come back to the other end of the mortise, and I can determine how deep am I at this point. I can lever out some of the waste. And here's another reason why you don't necessarily go right up to the end, because I can use that fulcrum point to lever out the material, and I'm going to deform that fulcrum point a little bit. So I don't necessarily want to work right up to my layout line because I've just rounded over my layout line. Once I've levered that out, you can then come in and you can use depth gauges, or you can kind of guesstimate. I will often drop the chisel down to its depth, come up and just see, okay, I'm 3/4 of an inch deep at this point, and I think I am about 3/4 of an inch deep. You saw one pass down, one pass back, 3/4 of an inch deep. So more than likely, if I'm making a 1-inch mortise, I would flip the bevel around again so that it's facing towards you guys, and I would work towards the camera again. One more pass back would probably be enough to get me to 1 inch deep. At that point, when I've reached my final depth, and generally what I've ended up creating is this kind of V shape where I have at the bottom of the V, I've got, we'll just say for this conversation, a 1 inch deep mortise. So it's 1 inch deep at the bottom of that V, and the walls slope up at angles from there. So now that I've hit my final depth, what I'll do is turn the back of the chisel, the bevel, away from the end of the mortise, and I'll just start chopping my way down. And again, because I've cleared out space, there's plenty of room for the waste to wedge into. So the wedge is not drawing things up tight. I'm now cutting with this chisel, and I'll take another step back. I'll chop down again. And what I'm doing is I've got this V shape. As I'm chopping, I'm kind of slowly taking this angled wall and kind of making a little bit straight. And then another chop makes a little bit straight. And then eventually the whole thing ends up straight. And I'm right on my layout line up here. So then you come back to the other side and you chop, makes a little straight, little straight, little straight, to the point where you now end up with 2 straight walls. Which, by the way, this is good triathlon swim technique right here. So the action of chopping a mortise, the biggest issue that I see, and this doesn't matter whether you're talking about a bevel edge chisel or a mortise chisel. Mortise chisels are nice because they are stout. You can actually take a little bit heavier cut to them. The wider walls, I especially like these English style mortise chisels. The wider walls will, nicely reference and help to keep things straight, but I don't find, other than the stoutness of it and the ability to cut a steeper bevel, there's really not that much difference in the technique from a bevel edge chisel to a mortise chisel. It's all about that wedging action. And the number one mistake that I see is hammering too hard. Mortising should not be, a full contact sport. Mortising is about just light taps. Now, let's stack the cards in our favor, and having a heavier mallet means an even lighter tap. But that's also one of the reasons that I tend to use these Shenandoah Toolworks mallets, because this big brass head, this thing is probably, I don't know, they say what the weights are, but I think this is substantially heavier than this, probably twice as heavy as this Bruce mallet. And it's great for much, much harder woods. With that one tap, I can go pretty deep with it, and I get a lot of control with it. But it's a subtle thing. It's utilizing that wedge to do the work for you rather than trying to muscle that sucker in. And the harder you tap it, the more you drive that wedge in, the more, first of all, it's going to stick. And if you've ever been chopping a mortise and the blade is stuck and you're like, trying to lever that thing out, I've done it, but that's a no-no. You have now wedged that wedge in too tightly, and you're going to cause deformation or problems or just slow things down. The lighter tap approach is going to controllably, in a controlled manner, remove waste a heck of a lot faster. And as you saw, one pass down and back got me to 3/4 of an inch deep. Granted, very soft wood, but 4 passes down, back, that's a 1.5 inch deep mortise very easily. And that takes, if you shut up and actually do it, 45 seconds maybe. So there's your technique. Very little difference. Oh, how many times have I been asked this question? What size and manufacturer would you recommend for my first back saw? Carcass saw is what I recommend, so about a 12-inch saw. File crosscut, because a carcass saw is a crosscut saw by definition. Manufacturer, my manufacturer of choice is probably Bad Axe, because they make really, really good saws, but it's also some of the more expensive saws on the market. You really can't go wrong with Lee Nielsen. You can't go wrong with any of the boutique makers, Fore, Bearcat, Bad Axe. I'm forgetting a bunch, I know, I apologize. Veritas is a really good carcass saw as well, and it is dirt cheap. You can look back a couple of live sessions to where I talk about back saws and I go into a whole diatribe about why there should be an asterisk next to the Veritas saws, and I will leave it at that. If you haven't seen that yet, go check it out. Back Saws 101, it was a couple weeks ago is when I did it, but definitely a carcass saw. It's the jack plane of saws. Most versatile, it's going to serve you for many, many years. There are even other makers of saws, even cheaper ones out there, but really, if price is the issue, I would go Veritas more than any other cheaper brand out there. I have a Bont saw, I have a Lee Nielsen saw, I have a Bad Axe saw, in carcass saws. They're all awesome. Choosing one is like choosing a favorite child. Can't really do that. I know that ticks people off when I don't do manufacturer recommendations, but the minute I suggest one manufacturer, people gang up on me and say, how dare you not suggest this one? How can you tell what's causing a wooden foreplane to clog? Whether it's the wedge, closed mouth, etc. A foreplane, it usually is the mouth because you're taking heavy shavings. A wooden plane especially, there are no moving parts. I mean, there's a wedge. There are no moving parts, so it's not a frog adjustment or anything like that. If it's clogging and it's because of the wedge, you're generally going to see shavings in between the wedge and the blade itself. You want to have a clean line. Yeah. Ooh, dusty. It just blew out my shop and I'm still dusty. You're not going to really be able to see this in this plane. Where the wedge contacts the blade, you want to have a clean transition. So when I pull the wedge out, what you want to see on that wedge is nothing. You want to see a sharp point. So when it mates with the blade, what I've got is a perfect mate. There's no flat spot there that the shaving can grab onto. If there's a flat spot, that will often prevent the shaving just enough. It'll cause the plane shaving to kind of hesitate, which can be enough to cause it to curl back on itself and clog in the mouth because it's curling back into the mouth. If you have any flat presented there at all, that can be a problem. You want it to just cleanly mate with the blade. But that can be fudged quite a bit with a foreplane because the foreplane is creating such heavy shavings. Those thicker shavings are going to come up over a step a little bit easier. So I'd be willing to bet that most of the time the clogging you're seeing on a foreplane is because the mouth itself is not wide open enough. And that you've got to come in with a file or whatever and open that mouth up a little bit more. I would do that anyway, just because I guess you can't say there's no such thing as too wide of a mouth on a foreplane. I mean, that's within reason, right? But you got to remove a lot of material before that mouth is too wide. So more than likely, the plane's just going to end up performing better with a wide open mouth anyway. So I would widen the mouth and see if that fixes your problem, and then widen it a little bit more and see if that fixes your problem. And if it still doesn't, then you can address the wedge. But most of the time, it's going to be the mouth, not the wedge. I just lost my place because the chat room jumped on me. How would you design your workbench if you had a 5 by 5 feet of working area? I would design my workbench to sit right in the middle of that room, and I would have at least 2 feet of clearance on one side of the bench. So, well, see, if it's only 5 by 5, then probably you're going to need to put it against the wall, because there's no way to put it in the middle of the room, assuming the bench is about 2 feet wide. That only leaves you 3 feet left, right? Well, that's 1.5 feet on either side of the bench. That's going to be a little tight. I want at least 2 feet of space on one side of the bench. So I would push it up against a wall, and I would make it as long as you can. Ideally, You've got a foot of space off the end of the bench in the direction that you would normally plane. Because I'm left-handed, I primarily plane left-handed. I'm working towards the right side of the bench. So I would want at least a foot of space between the end of the bench and the wall so that as I'm planing, I've got room for the toe of the plane to come off the bench. Or you can run it right all the way up to the wall and move your planing stop back so that you've got room before you hit the wall. You're not going to regret having more square footage of bench space. So if necessary, run it all the way to the walls and you'll be fine. If you have in vices, obviously that's not going to work. There are reasons why I sometimes like to get around the end of the bench. I do some sawing sometimes off this end of the bench, so having a little bit of clearance might be nice. So I would definitely push it up against the wall, leave plenty of space out there, and then kind of figure out how much space do I need on either end. You're not going to need as much as you might think. Okay, where are we here? I've got 5 minutes left. Easy question, how did I determine the height of my workbench and joinery bench? I practiced. I used a lot of, as I was building my bench, I built my bench top, and this is documented, granted in lovely low def now. It's documented as I built the bench, I had the thing sitting on sawhorses for years. And they were actually those Craftsman plastic ones, the adjustable ones, to the point where I was worried I might break the sawhorses, but they lived fine. I worked on that bench top for some time. Some of me was just being lazy and I was like, hey, I've got a bench top, I'll build the legs later. But I was able to shim that, I was able to move the sawhorses up and down, or you can just put blocks underneath it and raise and lower the height of my workbench. And I worked on that for quite a bit in order to figure out what worked best. Same thing with my joinery bench. I knew that I wanted a more upright posture, so I built the bench top and I used several different blocks. Actually, what I did was set it on my rouleau at the time and used different blocks underneath it to change the height, and I cut a bunch of dovetails on it, and that was the best way. I started at elbow height. That ended up within an inch of where I finished with the joinery bench. So you have kind of a ballpark that you're starting with, but the only way to know for sure is to actually cut some joinery on a joinery bench, plane some boards on a planing bench, and see, how does it feel? Am I stooping too much? My shoulders sore? Is my back sore? There could be issues there. You may need to change the height. It's the best way to do it is just do it. Just do work at that height and then raise it an inch and see how that feels. Paraffin Lamp says, is there a chart which shows which two species of wood look good together? I'm looking to make very small things and would love to know which pairs to consider. This is a highly subjective question. No, I don't know of a particular chart. Fine Woodworking did an article years ago about complementary wood species, and they threw out a bunch of different woods. In general, I think from a design perspective, you want complement over contrast. And the more you use contrast, the smaller you should do it. So having, a huge, and I'm going to pick on walnut and maple again. For those who don't listen to Wood Talk, know that I don't like that combination. If you have a huge panel door and the panel is all maple, so this huge swath of maple, and then the whole case is made out of walnut, to me, that's too much contrast. That doesn't work. The only way you can make that work is do something different with the maple. Maybe if we're highly figured maple, then the focal point becomes the figure in the maple and not the even balance between the dark walnut and the light maple. What I think looks better is darker brown walnut with a darker red-brown cherry. Now you're talking complementary colors and not contrasting colors. So as far as what goes well with one another, no. You really have to kind of go with your gut in this. The fortunate thing is if you're building smaller things, I think the smaller the object, the less contrast you want to have, really. Because it doesn't take a whole lot of contrast to overpower. So if you're building a small box, maybe just the knob is a different wood, but that can be a high level of contrast because it's a tiny little knob, but it's also a focal point of the piece. We're getting heavy into design talk here because it's not so much about the contrast and the complementary nature. It varies dependent upon the size and whether or not you want to draw attention to it. If you really want to draw attention like a big neon sign to that knob, then you'd use a highly contrasting species against the box. But as far as what the individual species are, maybe somebody has thrown that together. You really have to use some of your judgment and figure out, you know, here's the wood that I want to build with. I want to build this box out of cherry. Well, then most of the wood you're going to use is cherry. And the complementary or contrasting nature will depend heavily upon what you're complementing, the size and what you're contrasting. Again, focal points and levels of contrast. Arjun, top 3 to 5 hand tool woodworking shortcuts. Congratulations, you have just set a topic for a future week. That's not something I want to cover. That's a whole show in and of itself, but I'm making a note of that, and I will cover that in a couple of weeks, because that's a good one. Thank you, Arjun. Good question. Oh, thank you, Ronaldo. I'm happy to share. Teak or Bahia tulip wood for a paring chisel handle. There's no question there, Arjun. Teak or Bahia tulip wood, either one will work. I mean, it's a long handle, but it's not so long. I mean, we're not talking, even if it were 36 inches long, you're paring. Paring is not walloping with a mallet. As we just talked about, you're not doing a lot of walloping. Unless you're timber framing, that's a different story, but timber framing chisels are massively stout. The force on that long handle, here's a long paring handle with a socket that I often will pop my Lie-Nielsen chisels out, and I'll use this as a paring handle. You can use an even longer one. You're doing light force. You're paring with this. So the wood species you choose matters not at all. Not at all. Because why would the wood species matter? You're looking for the greatest strength along that length. So you want the greatest amount of strength. Well, you rive it out and you're going to get a super strong piece. But are you putting any heavy details in that? It's not like you're turning Windsor legs, so you need a tighter grain like maple for your Windsor legs. It's looks like this, right? I mean, there's no tight details that you're turning here or shaping or sculpting by hand. Besides, if you had a bunch of details on it, it would be uncomfortable to hold in your hand. So there's nothing in a paring handle that is going to cause undue stress on the wood that makes you think, I need to have a wood that has a high bending strength or a high density or a high Janka hardness. None of that matters. The force that you're exerting on it doesn't matter. So dealer's choice, my friend. The answer is Bahia, tulip wood, or teak, whichever you have, whatever you can get with. You know, whatever looks good, that's what you choose. Should you sharpen a mortise chisel to the same grit you would a normal chisel, or to a lower grit for a stronger edge? Sharpen it to the same grit, because why would I change my process? That's just too much thinking. But you change the bevel angle. So a lower grit, your assumption is a little specious there. The idea being that if I sharpen to a lower grit, the edge will be more durable. I actually say it's the opposite. The higher the grit you sharpen to, the more refined the edge. And the way I often tell people is, if you look at an edge, a perfect sharpened edge, obviously if my fingers were all the same length, I would have some sort of weird genetic issue, but you have one continuous edge here. The lower the grit, the more frayed that edge is. So instead of one blade, I now have, well, let's tuck the thumb out of the way. I have 4 blades, 4 little frayed edges. And this edge has its own strength and this edge has its own strength, but these edges are going to be weaker as these individual narrow edges than they would be as one unified edge. So the finer and finer grits you do, the more those frayed edges become 1 or 2 or 3. Woohoo. Stupid human tricks. So those higher grit sharpens leave you with an edge that is sharp, because all sharp is the perfect intersection of 2 angles, that 0-point interface, the Euclidean intersection of angles. That's sharp, whether it is at the perfect angle in one plane or in 4 planes. These are all sharp because they come together at that 0-point angle, but these individual fingers are not going to be as strong as one unified edge. So your assertion that using a lower angle or a coarser grit to make that bevel, that chisel last longer, I think is dead wrong. I think what you'll find is that chisel is going to fold and go dull a lot faster. It's a lot harder to bend this as one entity together than it is to try to bend one finger. That one little frayed edge is going to bend a lot faster than all 4 held together into one blade. But the way that I make mortise chisels more durable, And this is the only time I use multiple bevels in my work. I used to be a big micro bevel guy. Since I went to freehand work, I just don't do it anymore. It's too much work. So I have a nice laid back angle here. I can't remember what this angle is. It's laid back. It's low. It's probably under 25 degrees. What that does is move steel out of the way to give me plenty of clearance. So I've got a smaller footprint across the cross section to allow me to go deeper into a mortise without interfering, without causing that wedging action I was talking about earlier. But the lower the bevel angle, the smaller the amount of steel is at the end, which makes for a weaker edge, and it will fold easier. So right down to the end, it's easier to see in the reflection, you'll see I have a secondary bevel. This is not a micro bevel, this is a secondary bevel. That sucker is 1/8 of an inch wide. And that is set at 35 or so-ish degrees, much steeper. And I don't know if the resolution will pick that out, but yeah, you can see there is a difference there, a substantial difference. Now that steeper angle has allowed for more meat, more steel right down to the edge, giving me a steeper, more stout chisel tip. The sharpness, yeah, that's important. The sharper the steel, the easier, the less force is required to cut through the wood, so the wood won't bend as much. But if I had this sharpened to like, 80 grit or 100 grit, it's going to deform and fold and go dull a hell of a lot faster than if I sharpened it at 8,000 grit. Good? Makes sense? And again, like I said earlier, mortising is all about the wedge. So it's not really about the sharpness or the cutting action, it's all about that wedging action. So we create that wedge right at the end because that's where the wedge is, right? Same thing with a plane. The angle doesn't matter past the cutting edge. Once the shaving goes past the cutting edge, the mouth opens up dramatically on a plane because you need room for that shaving to curl in on itself. The tightness of the mouth is right there at the very tip. That's the only point that matters. Beyond it, it doesn't really matter. So, all right, guys. Did I actually get to all the questions? Oh, heck no, I didn't. I got to scroll down. That's all the time I have for this week, though. But if I didn't get to your questions and it's a burning question that you need answered right away, feel free to reach out. You can find me on Instagram. You can find me on the renaissancewoodworker.com. Or, if you really, really, really want to, you can support the show and you can ask questions via Patreon there as well. Or, you know what? You could also just become a member of the Hand Tool School. And then you've got become an apprentice and you can ping me at all hours of the night. I'm pretty good about getting back to you guys. And as I say every single week, for those that watch this show, RWW Live will get you 10% off everything there. But, I'm around. I will answer my emails and I do respond to my Instagrams and I'm very approachable. So feel free to hit me up with a question. If not, come back next week and we'll answer more questions. So thank you guys. Always a lot of fun. Love hanging out with you. Happy Wednesday and we'll see you next week.